In October, the U.S. Supreme Court will decide whether the parents of Sergio Hernandez Guereca, a 15-year-old Mexican teen killed by a Border Patrol agent, can sue the U.S. agent in U.S. federal court. The case began in 2010 after Border Patrol agent Jesus Mesa Jr. shot across the El Paso-Juarez border and struck Hernandez Guereca in the head. The teen had been playing with his friends on the Mexican side of the border when he was killed. The central question in the case is whether a Mexican citizen killed on Mexican soil by a U.S. border agent is protected by the U.S. Constitution, allowing for the family members of victims to file civil lawsuits. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of Hernandez Guereca's case, the decision will likely impact the case of 16-year-old Mexican teenager José Antonio Elena Rodríguez. For more, we continue our conversation with Lee Gelernt, Deputy Director of the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project, who represents José Antonio's family in the civil lawsuit. As you watched the mother and grandmother speak, it was very familiar to you, Lee,
Right.
because you've been in their homes so many times.
Right.
Talk about your involvement with this case and how this is going to the Supreme Court, even after the border agent was acquitted.
Right. So there are two parallel systems. The Justice Department brought the criminal case. The agent was acquitted. We're not sure how he was acquitted, but he was acquitted. And so that's that system. But we have brought a civil rights case against the agent himself for money damages. Obviously, money damages cannot undo what's happened, but it would be some vindication to have a lawsuit that's successful against the agent. And so we have prevailed so far in the lower courts, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said
that José Antonio's family can sue in a court here, though he was killed on Mexican soil.
Exactly. But Sergio Hernandez's case in Texas, that U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit said you cannot bring this civil rights suit. So the case has reached the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will hear the Hernandez case, which was ahead of our case, and that will likely impact what's happened. And I would say I've been doing this work a long time, and what I always try and do is explain to the family, this is the government's position. And generally speaking, people understand it. They don't agree with the government's position, but they understand. I would say this is the hardest time I've ever had in my 30-year career of explaining the government's position. Because what the government is saying is, he's a Mexican citizen on Mexican soil, although only 15 feet over the border. He cannot sue because this is essentially a case in Mexico, is what the government is saying. And the parent, his mother and his grandmother just look at me and say, but it's a U.S. agent using a U.S. firearm, standing on U.S. soil. Why does this not involve the United States government? Why does the Constitution not apply to him?
And for people to understand, when you say, how do you shoot through a wall? There are slats in this wall.
Exactly.
This wall is the equivalent of stories above where this boy was across the street in Mexico. But there are slats in the wall, and he shot through, pointing down. It's like a fish in a fishbowl.
Yeah.
And we talked to them right where he died. There is a mural of him, and they stood as if he was standing with them.
Right, and that is a street, a main thoroughfare in Nogales where people go to school, go to medical appointments, go to business appointments, and so they have to be walking there. If they are just sitting there and can be shot with constitutional impunity, that's a very dangerous situation. And we are hoping the U.S. Supreme Court says this civil rights suit can go forward, because this is the last straw, at least in our courts.
What's amazing in this trial is that his coworkers, the other border agents, they didn't shoot at José Antonio.
Right. I think what that...
They said they didn't see a threat.
Right. And if you've been there, and your piece did a great job of showing that you would essentially have to be a Major League Baseball player even to get a rock up there to come close to hitting anybody. And so what we've always said is, look, there's no way that he was in mortal danger and needed to shoot. But the question is not really whether José Antonio is throwing rocks or not. Assume for the moment, for purpose of argument, that he was throwing rocks. There's no way that the agent could have been hurt, and that's exactly shown by the fact that two other agents are standing there just watching.
And he also had lied in other situations. Explain Lonnie Swartz, who he was.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't know everything that's happened, but what we're understanding is that his disciplinary record record was not great, and stuff came out at the trial, and yet the jury still acquitted. And I think that just shows how hard it is
that he'd been discharged from the military.
That just shows how hard it is to convict a law enforcement agent, and that's why these civil rights lawsuits are so critical. That's why the government wants to shut it down. They're saying, we'll decide whether to discipline an agent, and that's, the fox guarding the hens.
And the significance of this U.S. Supreme Court case, not only for José Antonio's family, but for others, if it was...
I think it's enormous, because what it'd be saying is Border Patrol agents have basically impunity there, and what we're seeing, and we've seen for a long time, is serious abuse. And I think this administration's sending a signal, treat this as if it's a military operation, and so we're likely to see more and more abuse. And if the Supreme Court says these lawsuits can't go forward, that's going to be a very dangerous situation.